QSO Today episode 204, Shiwiak KE4PT. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, creators of the most state-of-the-art amateur radio transceivers at affordable prices, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX transceiver kit for under $50. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. One of the best-kept secrets of amateur radio is the amazing QEX Magazine, published by the ARRL and edited by my guest today, Shiwiak KE4PT. If you are a home brewer and want a more in-depth amateur radio technology understanding, then QEX should be on your workbench every month. Kai provides a fascinating look at home brewing, the digital modes, and modest antennas for the antenna challenged in this episode of QSO Today. KE4PT, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Kai?
Yes, this is Kai, KE4PT. Good day.
Kai, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started for me when I was a young teenager in Brooklyn, New York. I used to hang around with several friends, one of whom invited us to his home. I don't remember why, but I do remember the first thing that hit me was his dad was a ham, and there was this table full of all this wonderful equipment, and my eyes went gaga. So his dad set me up with a mentor, and that mentor was W2EW. That call's been reassigned, but at the time it was Ed Koch, W2EW. And I sat for the novice.
And not the Ed Koch who was mayor of New York.
Oh, no relation, as far as I know.
Okay, great.
As far as I know, no, not at all. He was, if you were to draw a caricature of an older ham at the FCC, it would be this thin, short guy with white hair and enthusiasm painted all over his face. That's the Ed that brought me through ham radio. And my first call sign was WN2PGH.
Now, there was a process to this at the same... How old were you at the time that you got your first license?
15. That was in 1964, the end of the year, probably November. I don't have a copy of that old license, but it's probably November, and I do know it was 1964.
So when you saw that friend's father's ham radio set up for the first time, what was that like? What did you think?
Well, I asked him, I says, wow, what's this? And he says, well, that's my dad's ham radio. I says, how does it work? And I guess he had a stock answer. He says, well, my dad talks to other people, and then they exchange these cards. And he showed me his dad's QSL card. And that didn't make much sense to me at the time, but the fact that he could speak to other people on the air just absolutely fascinated me. I wanted to do that.
And what was Ed Koch's W2EW? What was his process with you? What did he make you do in order to move you down the road to your first novice license?
He Elmered me through the novice class license. I'm a little bit hazy on the details, but I think he administered the novice class license to me. And then later on, when I upgraded, it was at the downtown Manhattan office of the FCC. I sat for my general class there, and I remember the view out the window. It was a very high floor up in the office building, and you could see New York Harbor and all that. This guy kind of was intimidating. I took the written test, and then I had to take the Morse code test. And I remember he stood just out of view on the right-hand side, just out of my field of view. And when I turned my head, he would step back. I turned my head back, he would step forward. I think he was playing with me.
Were you the only one there?
But
when you took the test?
There were several. There were several, 2 or 3 maybe. And when I took the test, there was also a sending test. I had to send a message with a straight key. So not only was there a receiving message, a receiving test, there was a transmitting test as well.
Do you think you had performance anxiety in sending in front of people in the FCC office, or were you a novice who was quite active?
I was an active novice, but I was thoroughly intimidated by DFCC, all in capital letters. I might have been less intimidated if it was administered by fellow hams, but here we are at the government office. I mean, wow. A 15-year-old in that situation.
Right. Well, it's an unusual situation, I think, for any 15-year-old. Do you remember your first rig?
Yes, I do. The receiver was a Hallicrafters SX110 that my dad, he mostly purchased it. I contributed what little meager funds I had at that time. And he wanted to do shortwave listening. He's from Poland, and he wanted to listen to Polish broadcasts. So that was my receiver. My transmitter was a pair of 1625s. I can't remember what the oscillator was, but it was a tube oscillator, maybe a 6AG7, and a pair of 1625s. And the funny thing was, when my novice license arrived, I had not yet finished the transmitter. So I quickly put together, in a matter of a few hours, bent up a chassis from a discarded piece of aluminum and one tube crystal oscillator running, I'm guessing it was not much more than 7 to 10 watts. And that's where I made my first contact with from Brooklyn to Illinois. What was his call sign? K9 something. Can't recall it right now. But I was beside myself. Wow. All that distance.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So,
it seems like it's the other end of the world when you're a kid.
Yeah, it is. It is the other end of the world, and the fact that it worked was interesting too. Now, I don't know. I'm pretty sure many of the listeners would know that back then novices were crystal controlled, rock bound. So you had your crystal for transmitting, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the other guy comes back to you on that frequency. In fact, most of the time they didn't. So during those days, calling CQ was long. You called very long and often, and then you would listen, and the guy that would be returning your call would also be calling you for quite a long time because you had to tune the entire novice band to find him. So in a way, all those QSOs were split, which was an interesting way to operate. I learned split as a novice. I guess that's the bottom line.
You learned to operate split as a novice. Well, that's pretty cool. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yes, it did. I had always been, as far as I could remember, interested in electrical things. I built electric motors. I remember building a little AM transmitter that was the size of your fist, and on the other side of the wall from an AM receiver that my parents were listening to, and I would break in with a hello. So, yeah, I was always interested in that, and when it came time to decide what I wanted to study for in college, in the university, the choice was pretty clear to me. It was electrical engineering, and that's what I did.
And where'd you go to school?
Brooklyn Polytech, which is now part of New York University. But at the time, it was the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn on J Street in Brooklyn Heights. So I got my bachelor's in electrical engineering and followed on with a master's in electrical engineering from Brooklyn Poly. And then a career in electrical engineering.
And where did you go? Did you stay in the New York area?
No, I didn't. It was interesting. At the time I got my bachelor's, there was the telephone company had a strike going, and there was all kinds of turmoil. There was a downturn in the economy. Nobody was getting jobs. And I was hanging around the office of a professor who I hiked with. We used to do some hiking in New York State, and he asked me, "What are you doing for your? What are you going to do now that you're got your degree?" And I says, "Well, I don't know. I'll take the summer off, and I'll see if things are better in the fall." And he says, "Wait a minute. And he goes to his filing cabinet and starts rifling through papers. And he says, yeah, I could support a student. He says, all you got to do is get into grad school, and I've got a grant for you. Paying tuition was always a problem. We were not that well off. So that was an interesting offer. I took him up on it, and that's how I got into the master's program. And towards the end of the master's program, in answer to your original question, I shared an office with other grad students, and the master's advisor comes running in apologizing to me that he gave my name and contact information out to this guy in Raytheon in Massachusetts, and he hoped I wouldn't mind. I was ready to kiss his boots. This is a job that's going to come out of this. So the guy got in touch with me. My first airplane ride ever was Brooklyn to, LaGuardia to Boston. And I had an interview at Raytheon, got the job, and spent 7 years there, 7 very good years before I moved to Motorola.
Oh, what kind of work were you doing at Raytheon?
The work was for the Missile Systems Division, and I was designing antennas as well as missile radomes. And it was all classified work, so that's about all I could say about it, I guess, even today.
And then you say you went on to Motorola?
It was. Then I went on to Motorola.
Mm-hmm. Where?
Down in Plantation, Florida.
Sure.
And compared to the work that I had been doing, which was all, everything I did at Raytheon was gigahertz plus, all the way up to 94 gigahertz. And when I came to Motorola, all of the work was, what do the handheld radios work at that time? They were VHF and UHF in the 450 megahertz band. So it was like stepping down almost to DC by comparison to the techniques that I was using at Raytheon. But it was a lot closer to the kind of radios that I would use as a ham. So I loved it. I ate it up.
When I first became a ham in the 70s, I had a Motorola HT220 UHF portable. Is that something that might have come from the Plantation, Florida plant there?
Yes, it would have been built in Plantation, Florida. That product was pretty much mature by the time I was there, and they were already making follow-ons to those handheld radios. Plantation was handheld radios and radio pagers at that time, and it was a great place to work. I enjoyed every minute of it.
And what products did you work on?
HD2. Actually, I didn't work in a product group. I worked in a group called Applied Research. And what we would do was look at next generation stuff and build prototypes and solve problems with current radios that the product groups, it just wasn't their task to do. So things I worked on, one of the things I remember working on was developing a acknowledge-back pager, a pager that had a transmitter and it would acknowledge that it got the message. And it was tiny. It was my first microprocessor-controlled design, and it didn't go anywhere because what we were trying to do was reuse the frequencies of VHF and UHF, and what made that moot was when the FCC allocated frequencies around 930 megahertz, 902 and 930 for paging systems, other systems as well. So that kind of made the acknowledge-back paging at VHF no longer necessary. But still, it was a fun project.
Well, they ended up making Motorola made a 900 megahertz talkback pager, as I recall.
Yes, they did.
In the late 80s, I think, right? Early 90s.
Yeah, and the FCC had allocated 2 frequency bands for that, so we were no longer in this difficulty of trying to share the outgoing paging channel with short bursts for receiving. You could do a full up acknowledge-back system using dedicated frequencies.
I think at that time there was companies like PageNet, which became a nationwide radio paging company that probably were doing talkback paging about that time. But we also... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was sorry to interrupt. I was going to say that Motorola's customers were not pager users. They were the paging operators
companies,
and
right.
providers. Yeah, paging companies. That's who were the... That's what was the interesting thing about it. Our customers were the paging, the pager people, and we never saw the subscribers themselves. That was we were one step removed from that.
Well, I had a radio pager repair business in the late '80s through the mid '90s, and so I saw all of that Motorola technology come across our workbenches. From the carriers themselves. So the carriers would send us the pagers. That's why I find paging interesting. It's my understanding that you also had a facility then in Boynton Beach later on that actually manufactured the Motorola pagers before it went to China.
Yeah, that's correct. The Boynton Beach plant was built as a dedicated paging facility, and one of their innovations was the robotic pager assembly line. And at the time, placement of parts on tiny boards was difficult to do, difficult to get the precision. And that problem was solved by the Boynton folks.
I had a chance to be in that plant while they were making the Bravo pagers. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, you saw people loading parts in at the beginning and people taking completely built pagers out at the end, but there was like nobody in the middle.
Yeah. And the design philosophy changed as well. Previous to that, two-way radios and also pagers, they were built to the best specification that you could possibly have, and they were hand-tuned and honed to work the best possible. They exceeded specs, and that turned out to be not a very reliable way to make radios. Following that and the robotic assembly, radios were designed to work with parts that had tolerances. So the performance specification, they were not at the high end of performance. They were right on target, plus or minus a very small amount. They were all very much the same, one to another. And that resulted in the refurbishing or the part on the line where they repair pagers to bring them into spec. That all went away. Those were the days of the Six Sigma program and things like that. Even prototypes were not hand-assembled, but were made on the paging line. Onesies and twosies of prototypes. That's how far they took it.
Amazing.
It was interesting times.
Yeah, I'll say. And now this message from ICOM America. By the time that you hear this podcast message about ICOM, Field Day might just be over. I hope that you took your ICOM rig into the field for a great weekend. The ham radio year is full of contests, grid square chasing, and other just fun on-the-air activities that can be enhanced using the latest ICOM rigs. The newest addition to the ICOM line is the 100-watt IC7610, a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the definition of the SDR transceiver. The new IC7610 uses an RF direct sampling system where the RF signals are directly converted into digital data, now capable of 110 dB RMDR, one of the best in its class to pull out those weak signals in a high-noise environment. With an independent dual receiver design, you can hunt and pounce on your next contest or just give a casual listen to the DX and other bands. The IC7610 employs dual Digicell preselectors that are very sharp RF filters to reduce the effect of very strong out-of-band signals. The IC7610 should be your first choice as you sharpen your on-the-air skills. The IC7300 is just about everybody's favorite high-performance and innovative 100-watt HF transceiver, priced to be everyone's next rig. With its RF direct sampling and 15 discrete bandpass filters, this is an ideal rig to chase DX, work the digital modes SSB and CW. With its beautiful and large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, With real-time spectrum scope, even the beginner can quickly master what's happening and where in any band. Finally, if you want the shack rig that will take you to the stars, then the 100-watt IC9100 is the rig for you. The IC9100 is an HF, VHF, and UHF all-mode rig that will allow you to begin to master the challenging modes, including meteor scatter and moon bounce. In the satellite mode, the IC9100 will even correct for Doppler shift as the satellite passes overhead. Of course, since you can do just about anything with the IC9100, you can take advantage of its independent dual receivers, digital IF filters, and an internal antenna tuner. So there you have it. ICOM has you covered as you think about your next rig to upgrade your ham shack and operation going forward. Be sure to try out these fine ICOM rigs at the nearest amateur radio store near you, or go to ICOM America's website by clicking on the links in this week's show notes page. Be sure to tell them that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. You founded in the early 2000s a company called Time Derivative Inc., a wireless consulting business that you had. And your specialty was ultra-wideband radio technology. What is ultra-wideband radio technology?
Okay. I left Motorola to join Time Domain Corporation, a startup in Huntsville, Alabama, that was into what was called ultra-wideband radio. And ultra-wideband radio is another way of sharing spectrum. The one we're familiar with is we share spectrum by chopping up channels into segments, and then you have everybody's assigned that frequency, that small bandwidth, 15 to 25 kilohertz channel. Ultra-wideband radio smears the signal over a very wide frequency, but does it with impulse radio. So you send this impulse, and you share. Everybody shares that huge spectrum, but their impulse pattern is different, is orthogonal to yours. So you have many users that use the same wide bandwidth now, but they're all taking up the whole bandwidth. Very much like spread spectrum technology that Qualcomm uses in the cell phone business, except the spreading that we were doing in ultra wideband was 3 to 5 gigahertz wide. So it was pretty wideband stuff. After leaving Time Domain, I started Time Derivative and took on consulting work with various players in ultra wideband, primarily in trying to develop a standard, an IEEE 802 standard on ultra-wideband technology, and it was acrimonious. There were many players that didn't like what was going on, and eventually ultra-wideband pretty much got killed, except for some niche product developers that did something with it. But you won't find much on the market today.
So Wi-Fi would not be considered ultra-wideband? Oh,
no. Wi-Fi is channelized.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, actually, under the 802.11, there is, we eventually did get a radio layer that's ultra-wideband, but I don't think anybody's using it in any product development, but the standard does exist.
Kai, what's your current rig?
I'm down to a Yaesu 817 that I like to use in portable situations. And once I got all I thought I could get from the indoor antenna, about 225 DXCCs, the ones that remained were starting to get difficult. So at that point, I transitioned to use our South Florida DX Association club station. The rig then at the time was ICOM 756 Pro 3. So that became my station at that point. I did take the 817 on the road with me. One visit to my daughter in New Zealand, I brought the radio along with a Alex loop 1 meter diameter antenna and played a little bit of digital radio and worked a friend of mine here in Florida, 2.5 watts JT65. And kudos to Joe Taylor and his developers for developing those protocols. They are the future of ham radio.
Well, that's pretty amazing. You're a antenna specialist. You write lots of articles about antennas and stuff like that. What do you think of magnetic loop antennas for the QRP operator, or maybe even the HOA challenged operator?
Well, drop the word mag or magnetic and just say small loop antennas, and you'll be right on target. And I say that because loop antennas of the kind that people use at HF, roughly 1 meter in diameter, have a substantial electric field associated with them, so they're not pure magnetic loops, nowhere near. And I think they're very effective if you make them up with what I call the DX knob on your radio. The DX knob is your choice of modulation, going from AM modulation to, let's say, JT65. There's about 50 dB of link margin. It takes 50 dB more power or more resource to do AM than it does to do JT65. So if you're going to use an indoor small antenna that's a compromised antenna, you want to make up for that link margin by going to the digital modes, FT8, JT65, JT9, that kind of stuff. I think I've made lots of contacts from inside my house. Before I went to New Zealand, I wanted to make sure I had all the equipment and the connectors and everything was set up. So I set up my station in my living room and then worked about 20 or 30 Europeans from South Florida. Yeah, they could be effective, but don't expect miracles. It takes operating technique to do it, but it's possible.
Do you have a favorite operating mode then?
The all-time long-term favorite has been Morse code. And when I go somewhere, like take the radio on a trip, the favorite mode is usually Morse code. But in New Zealand, I did a little bit of calculating beforehand. Even Morse code wasn't going to make it, not on 2.5 watts on a small loop antenna. I transitioned to JT65. So those digital modes are among the favorites also. CW and the WSJT-X suite of digital codes. Reluctantly, I'll do single sideband, but I'm not thrilled by it.
Have you had a chance to do FT8?
Actually, no, I haven't. I've been too busy with the editing. I edit QST technical articles and all of QEX, and I just haven't had the time to get into FT8. But that's next on my bucket list.
You mentioned that you have a portable rig, which was that ASU FT817 that you take on trips with you. What else is in your go bag when you travel on business?
In the radio go bag, I have the FT817, and I have a battery pack from Goal Zero. That's 100 watt hours. That's about the same size as the radio. Plus, I have all the connectors, and I have a off-center end-fed dipole of my own design that wraps up into a small Ziploc baggie. And that's the basic radio that I could do all of the traditional modes, but mostly CW out of that. If I have to add a computer, then I take my computer bag along and with a SignalLink USB audio card. And that combination with the DX Go bag, radio bag, lets me do all the digital modes as well.
Now you mentioned your unique dipole antenna, and is that what you call the OCEF dipole?
Yeah, it's off-center fed, off-center end fed dipole. It was important for me to be able to get an antenna that needed just one distant point that supports it. So the dipole, the antenna consists of coax extending from some chokes to about 1/3 of the way in. At that point, the center conductor extends all the way out. So that's the off-center fed. But through the coax, it's end-fed, if you see what I mean. Physically, it's end-fed. Electrically, it's off-center fed. And the other side of the choke, the ferrite bead chokes, the coax continues to an antenna tuner. And with that antenna tuner, a tiny Elecraft, oh geez, they're going to hate me for this. I forgot the model number, but it's the size of really like a deck of cards, the antenna tuner. With that, I'm able to get on 80 through 6 meters. It'll kick that antenna into resonance on all the ham bands.
So that would be the CAT1 antenna tuner, would it not be? KAT1?
No, that's not it. It's Elecraft T1.
T1, right, okay, right. That's their little tiny ultra small size portable tuner. Is the Elecraft T1?
Yeah, that was my home brewer's wake up call. I found out that my fingers were just barely in condition to wind all those toroids, and my eyes were just barely good enough to populate the board and get it all soldered up. Let's face it, we're all aging.
But I think you can buy the T1 and the other antenna tuners. I think you can buy them with the toroids now pre-wound for extra money. But yeah, they've recognized what you found in your survey, that we're all getting old. That's right. At least the listeners to the QSO Today podcast are getting old. And these little tiny ferrite donuts might be a little bit hard. I think the wire on that tuner is like 28 gauge or 30 gauge enameled wire, right?
It's something close to that. I don't recall the exact figure. But the whole point, the whole point was that you had to keep looping it through the ferrite, and the fat fingers that make typing mistakes don't work so well on tiny pieces like that anymore.
I read that you were once a member of SAREX. What is SAREX, and how were you involved in it?
SAREX was originally Shuttle Amateur Radio Experiment, and it was the mechanism, the project under which we flew ham radio in the space shuttle. I think the total number of missions was mid-20s, 26. It had the most frequent flyer miles of any other payload in the shuttle. And Owen Garriott was the guy who initiated, astronaut Owen Garriott was the first guy to initiate SAREX. It didn't have the name SAREX at the time, but he flew on ST9, a Motorola, a handheld radio supplied by the Motorola Club, which was an MX300 5-watt radio programmed on ham frequencies. And from the second mission on to when they, to the end of that entire program, I helped out as the liaison between whatever modifications needed to be made to the radio at Motorola, the liaison to NASA. And it was exciting. It got me on board all but 2 of the space shuttles during testing. And there were a lot of modifications that were made to satisfy the various missions that those radios flew. Well, after the shuttle program, it went to the space station, the International Space Station, where Shuttle Amateur Radio Experiment became Space Amateur Radio Experiment.
And now this message from QRP Labs. I hope that you caught Hans Sommer's speech to the FDIM QRP conference in Dayton last month, featured on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. I will put a link in the show notes pages so that you can find this very interesting and entertaining talk. Hans spoke about the development and the design of his QRP Labs QCX transceiver, where his objective was to break all the rules and create the best Arduino-based single-band transceiver kit at a low price. Hans has done exactly that, and the chances of working another QCX on the air gets better every day. The QCX is a feature-packed, high-performance single-band 5-watt CW transceiver kit with a whisper beacon and built-in alignment and test equipment. It's available in multiple bands, including 80, 40, 60, 20, 30, and 17. It uses a rotary encoder synthesized tuning, VFO A-B split, a built-in iambic keyer, a CW decoder, and more. All of this for under $50 US. Let me say that again, under $50 US. So when you're looking for your next ham radio kit project, go directly to QRP Labs by clicking on the link on the QSO Today show notes pages. This is the best way that you can tell Hans that Eric at QSO Today sent you. QRP Labs is my first choice for ham radio kit projects. It should be yours too. And now back to QSO Today.
And you had a question on that?
Well, I was interested in what kind of modifications you'd have to make to a Motorola MX300 to fly it in space. To fly it on the shuttle or to fly it on the space station.
Okay, to space qualify the radio, the only thing we needed to do to the standard product off the line was remove all adhesives and labels because they were not compatible with the cabin atmosphere. So that otherwise it met all NASA specifications for space flight. Now the changes that we needed during the program were there's a phenomenon that happens when dozens and dozens of stations that are nearly equal in signal strength appear in the front end of an FM radio. Because they're Doppler shifted, they occur at random frequencies across the whole channel, and to the radio, that looks like white noise. So what happens is the squelch locks up because it thinks it's white noise. And that was one of the problems, that the only signal that got through was the guy that was stronger than the sum of everyone else that was transmitting. One of the modifications they then requested was an external squelch control. So we did that. We gave them an external squelch control. Later missions, we tied into spacecraft power, which means we had to design and build a very special power adapter to the radio so it could work off spacecraft power. What else did we do? There were so many little things that along the way were modifications to the radio, but they were all a result of peculiarities on how that propagation path worked.
Oh, that's quite interesting. And what kind of modification would you have made to the radio so that it could pick out those individual stations? Was there something that you could do?
Well, operating procedure. The first thing we did was we gave them an external squelch control where they could reduce the squelch. Mm-hmm. The second thing we did was we distributed the earthbound users into 10 channels. So the astronaut would always transmit downlink on one channel, but he would listen on one of 10 uplink channels. And he would do that by rotating the frequency control knob, another modification we made for his radio, on one of 10 uplink channels. So that sort of divides the problem to 10% of the original.
I see. That's very clever.
Yeah. We learned a lot.
You're a prolific contributor to QST Magazine and editor of the QEX Magazine, which is also published by the ARRL. Can you talk about QEX Magazine, where you're the editor, and who is it for?
QEX is a separate journal. Well, first of all, QST is the member journal. You become a member of ARRL, you get QST as the member journal. And it has a lot of operating stuff, has some technical articles. But the bulk of the high technology level articles is QEX, the experimenters journal. And it'll run anywhere from 5 to 10 highly technical articles in up to 48 pages. And it's a separate subscription from the ARRL. You don't have to be a member to subscribe. You just have to pay for the subscription.
And do you have a profile of who your readers are in terms of their capability or their interests? Or
yeah, I laugh because we go to these surveys. 46% of the readership is 70 years old or older. Another 46% are 60 years of age, 60 to 70. And the remaining several percent in the survey were in their 50s. in the decade of the 50s, and we got no responses for younger than that. So if anything, it says they're an old crowd, an older crowd. They're the sages and the mentors of ham radio.
I would say they're the people that the QSO Today podcast generally talks to. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's an interesting magazine, and has very in-depth technical articles. Why do you suppose that is? Is it marketing, or does it make you think that perhaps home brewing, the state of home brewing and rolling your own rig, is a dying art form?
Oh, it's hard to say. Continuing on with the profile of the QEX readers, the vast majority of them are extra class license holders. But a better answer to what's going on in the technology is that QST has to cater to the general membership. They have to be interesting and pertinent to those folks in their teens to early 20s, teens through their 20s that just joined ham radio. So they wouldn't be interested so much in highly technical, lots of equations kind of articles that are state of the art. That's the stuff that went into QEX. And we've just passed 300 issues since QEX was born.
Do you think that home brewing and rolling your own rig is rapidly becoming a lost art form?
No, it's changed dramatically. When I was a novice, an early user of ham radio, the typical place where you'd get parts was a discarded television chassis. You had, except for a crystal, you had everything on that chassis to build a transmitter. And there was a lot of Army surplus gear that was available, and home brewing was built around those technologies, tube technology. Today, most electronics, you can't salvage much of anything from today's discarded electronics. It's built with so much integrated application-specific circuits that they're of little use to hams. Instead, what we do have is the movement that introduced Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and all of the daughter boards that plug into these small computers. You can now build a solid-state transmitter with a highly stable synthesized VFO by simply plugging half a dozen parts together with an Arduino computer. And the big problem then is programming it, which itself is not a problem because there's so much published software out there as a starting point. No, homebrewing has changed. It hasn't gone away. The old cannibalize a TV chassis type of homebrewing, that's gone. That's forever gone. But homebrewing has just changed into something different.
So does QEX Magazine then feature this new technology as well? Do you have a lot of projects that include Arduinos or Raspberry Pis in your mix of articles?
Yeah, they're in the construction articles. Yes, they tend to crop up all the time. Also with QST, there are QST projects that feature those small computers quite regularly. Yeah. So what's it called? The Maker Spare movement.
The Maker movement, right?
Maker movement. Yeah, that is an example of the kind of technology that's available. They're not hams. Many of them are, and many of them cooperate with hams, and they use the same techniques and technologies. But yeah, the small computer and those boards that are digital synthesizer boards and all these plug-in boards, they're what home brewers are increasingly doing.
What makes a dipole antenna a tripole antenna?
If you feed it without a balun.
Well, I saw an article that you wrote, whether to balun or not to balun, that's the question. And so you talk about a dipole and tripole. Could you kind of explain what you mean by a tripole and how a balun may improve that?
Yeah, a dipole is a perfectly symmetrical balanced antenna. It has a left side and a right side, but these days we like to feed them with coax, but coax is not balanced. The shield and the inner conductor have a different relationship to ground than the two sides of a dipole. So you need this device in between that prevents the dipole from making currents flow on the shield of the coax. And when you don't have that device there, the shield radiates. So it looks like a third element on the dipole, hence tripole.
I see in the magazines that there is a choke made from, wrapping the coax around, like 8 times around a 4-inch sewer pipe, plastic sewer pipe, called an ugly balun. Is that something that people should use on their, should they wrap the end of their coax before it goes to feed the antenna wire around an ugly balun in order to make, to keep the currents off of the coax coming down to the shack?
Yes, that's always a good idea, and that's a very easy one to make. The size and the number of turns determines over which frequency range it'll be effective. But yeah, I always recommend some sort of a current choke or balun when you use a dipole antenna.
Are hams that live in HOA areas with antenna restrictions out of business, do you think?
No, some might be close to out of business, but there are ways. They're not very effective. In one room, for example, near the ceiling, you could hang a loop that encircles the room, feed it with a balanced tuner, and you have a capability. It won't be very effective, but you could make up for the lost effectiveness by using the WSJTX communication modes. So they'll make up the range lost by a fairly deaf antenna. No, they're not out of it completely, but of course, if you get anything outside, it helps.
Well, I like I want to go back because you said something earlier where you said that there's a 50 dB link margin between operating in the AM mode in JT65, and I think that's kind of what you're saying here as well, and that is that your antenna might be compromised because you're living in a HOA neighborhood, so therefore you're putting some kind of stealthy wire in your attic or around the eaves of your house or something like that, but that you can make up that link margin by changing the emission mode or the operating mode that you're using in order to be more effective. I think that's kind of like my big takeaway from our QSO so far.
Yeah, that is. In fact, I did write a QST article about that. How much punch do you get from different modes? A title similar to that. And my co-author and I, Bruce Pontius, W0ADL, might have got the call wrong. I apologize to him. But Bruce and I did a study of the different modes, the effectiveness. We even made some measurements. And then we published a table of how effective the modes are and how that translates into range. If for example, you fix the radios, you make them a 100-watt transceiver at each end, and that's your limit, 100 watts PEP. What can that radio do with AM? Pretty poor. What can it do with single sideband, RIDI, CW, PSK31, and the WSJTX modes? And you find out that the link margin varies up to 50 dB from AM, which hardly anybody uses anymore, on up to JT9.
Yeah, pretty cool.
But yeah.
Should hams have QSL cards? Should hams go out and print QSL cards these days, and especially in this time of electronic logging, like Logbook of the World?
It's still a courtesy. I tend to send them out, especially if I want a particular verification back. But yeah, I think they're still important, less so than they were in the past. Logbook of the World works for certainly all of the awards sponsored by ARRL. and other organizations. EQSL has its own set of awards, none of which require, in fact, you can't do paper QSLs with EQSL. They don't count. There's no way to make a paper QSL count to their awards. ARRL, Logbook of the World, you can mix paper QSLs with Logbook of the World QSLs. But yeah, you're right. Paper is becoming less and less prevalent, but I still like to get them. I tell you, it's still a nice thing to get in the mail.
Yeah, I get a kick out of it, frankly. I just got one last week, and I like getting them. I scan them and we'll put them on my online QSL wall, I think, at some point. But it's nice to get them. They're fun to look at. What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, I stepped away from heavy use of ham radio during the kids growing up years. In fact, all I did was support the SARIX project during those years. But what effect has it had? Well, for one thing, my wife got herself licensed at the time she was a teacher, and she started ham clubs in the schools where she taught. And there's quite a few licensed hams that are a result of her classes. Both my son and daughter are licensed hams. My son is KE4JAS, and my daughter is KE4QXL, newly general. She sat for the general test last time she was in the States. And my wife is KE4IEB. Not very active on the air, but she was very active in getting new hams in. So, yeah. And she says, go play ham radio when she wants me out of her hair.
Is your wife still teaching?
No, she's no longer teaching. She was a Spanish teacher when she was active, and there came a point where it just became too much of a hassle to do. She loved the kids, but everything else that came with it, interacting with school boards and things like that, it just became too much after a point. And she said, I'm not having fun anymore at this. So she stopped it. She gave up on teaching.
Yeah, I'm married to a school teacher as well, and I'm beginning to hear the echoes of this kind of issue. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Well, I think that the quality of even the lowest cost radios is so much greater than what it was before, is one thing. And the second thing is the proliferation of the new digital modes. You know, if we're going to have a presence in space, for example, a lunar base, we're going to need these kinds of modes to communicate effectively over that distance. And there's a mission to Mars, and certainly in my kids' lifetime, if not my own, but ham radio is going to play a role there too, and it's not going to be AM or SSB. So what excites me is the new technology, the easy availability of high precision technology, and the work that's being done to get those digital modes more and more effective.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
Embrace the changes. Embrace the new modes. Try them. You'll like them.
I think that's great. I think I think there wasn't there some kind of commercial in the 60s or 70s, try it, you'll like it, and I think that applies to ham radio as well. You've been a great guest, Kai. I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast. As usual, I learned something new and have an appreciation for something old. So with that, I want to wish you 73 and thank you again for coming on QSO Today.
Yeah, 73, Eric, and thank you very much.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Kai. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KE4PT in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you purchase their fine products, be sure to say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Again, I'm always grateful for your show of support for the QSO Today podcast. Just about every audio source, including iHeartRadio and Spotify, and the iTunes Store, of course, feature the QSO Today podcast. I can even ask Alexa to play the latest episode. How about that? Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.